Welcome to the On Adventure podcast. I'm Josh Self, and I'll be your host today. Today's guest has chased something most people have never heard of, and fewer still have even attempted. Ken Posner is an ultrarunner, an author, and a former Army Ranger whose new book, called Chasing the Grid, chronicles his quest to summit all 35 high peaks of New York's Catskills, but it has to happen every month of the year, a feat known as the grid. But this isn't just about endurance, it truly is about transformation. Over the course of these grueling climbs and off-trail bushwhacks, Ken stripped away technology, experimented with barefoot running, and found a deeper spiritual connection to the mountains. Along the way, he set records on legendary routes like the Badwater Double and the Long Path, proving that our greatest challenges can also be our most profound teachers. Today, in the conversation, we'll unpack the physical, mental, and even philosophical journey behind his pursuit of the ultimate mountain challenge. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Ken Posner. Ken Posner, welcome to the On Adventure podcast. We've been chit-chatting here for about 10 minutes and good conversation so far. So I may need to clip some of that and bring it into the actual podcast. So thanks for being here on a Friday afternoon. We got, I think, a lot to talk about, but I appreciate you doing this. And I always like to start with, for anybody that is listening and doesn't know you, tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're at.
Hey, Josh, thanks so much. And thank you so much for having me on your show. And I love what you're doing with the theme of adventure. I don't know, I'm a runner and I'm a financial analyst and I'm trying to be a writer as well. Those are sort of the three themes in my life. And, I'm a corporate worker today, as I have been for many years. And that's where I practice my financial skills. But running's been a very important part of my life. And it really started in my late 30s because I saw people beginning to drop by the wayside. And I was like, I was getting promoted because other people were getting sick. And I was like,
within your company,
yeah.
You were seeing this happen. Okay.
I'm like, there's a, and this is Wall Street stuff. So the volatility is right in your face. And I was like, I better invest a little bit into my own platform to make sure I survive in this job. And that's when I got back into running, and I did some marathons, and that turned into some ultra marathons and eventually some multi-day runs and a couple of fastest known times. But as I got older, the pure aggressive ultra running began for me to get a little bit harder. And some people have been able to sustain that into their 60s and 70s and 80s, and that's cool. I went on a different branch. I got into peak bagging, or climbing lists of peaks. And also I got into a super minimalist approach. So now most of what I do is barefoot, actually. And that's a little bit different anyhow.
All right. So, million things to jump into from what you just said, but let me start with the obvious one. Barefoot, are you still running on trails barefoot, or is this hiking barefoot? Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, running on rocky trails barefoot is very hard to do. So mostly I run barefoot on roads and sidewalks. And, if I can find sandy trails or trails that aren't too rocky, for sure. But in the mountains, particularly in the Northeast, where it's rocks and roots and everything else, that tends to be more hiking.
Got it. What made you go from wearing shoes to one day going, yeah, I think I'll do this without shoes? Was it because I read the Born to Run book, and that kind of kicked off a lot of the minimalism idea, and you hear about barefoot runners in that, but was that part of it, or tell me how you got to that point?
Well, here's the annoying thing. Chris McDougall is not returning my phone calls because apparently I read that book. Apparently Born to Run is the single best-selling running book of all time, I think.
I can believe that.
But I didn't get the memo. The memo said, hey, this is an idea. Mm-hmm. It's about that primal connection with nature, but you're not supposed to actually do it. Just think about it. So I didn't get that memo, and I tried it for purely 1,000% pragmatic reasons. Because like I said a second ago, as I got older, I was pushing myself in the ultras and starting to get injured, right? So I thought, I ought to try this barefoot stuff because McDougall makes the argument that it's more natural and thus better for you. And I also said, look, as I'm getting a little bit older, maybe doing something a little bit slower and shorter distances, maybe that's not a bad idea. And it would be sort of cool to do something new where I could get better. So if I start really tentative and slow, maybe I can improve over time. So that was the rationale, 1000% pragmatic. But the surprise was how much fun it was. And so then I quickly lost interest in shoes. And nobody, I mean, if you had asked me 10 or 15 years ago, I would never have imagined this happening.
Hmm.
I'm not exactly, a flower child.
Okay. What was it? What is it that is so fun though? Yeah, tell me more about that.
It makes you feel like a kid again, and it turns every walk, hike, or run into an adventure because you got to pay attention. I call it the original human mindfulness. And people point out the feet have as many nerve endings as the hands or the face. So there's a lot of sensation. And, I went out for my first barefoot run, and, my response was like totally meh. I was embarrassed, self-conscious, and I got some scratches, and I was like, all right, so I did it. But the next morning I woke up, my feet were sort of tingling, and they were like, we want more. We want more sensations. We were designed to feel the ground so that we could send signals to the brain about how to move soft body parts over rough terrain. That's what we do. We want more of this. We don't want to be, bundled up, and we don't want to be sheltered and shielded. We want direct connection with nature.
Yeah. That's interesting. A lot of the modern day shoes have these giant cushioned soles, and it's supposed to be like walking on clouds. And what I have found, and I'm not barefoot, but I do like a minimalist trail shoe, zero drop, not a ton of sole, but enough to give me some traction. But I can feel every rock and root that I step on, and that versus being like in this cocoon of a shoe where I feel like my feet go to sleep. They don't have to do the work. Right. And so I can totally relate to what you're saying, even though I'm not totally barefoot doing it, that there is a more of a sensation connection for the brain to be able to feel its way, the feet to feel its way through trails. Cause I get people to ask me that all the time when I'm running. How do you twist your ankle? How do you not break your ankle? And do you trip on stuff all the time? Like, well, yeah, I do trip sometimes, but there's times when I catch myself not paying attention, and I've run for I don't know how long, and I haven't tripped on anything. Right there, I really do feel like maybe it's my brain, or maybe it's the sensation in my feet, like I'm feeling my way along without necessarily seeing. So, do you have a similar experience to that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, your feet will teach you real fast to pay attention. They'll be like, hey, asshole, don't do that.
Don't do that
Because
again.
feet are mission critical equipment, just like the heart is. For our ancestors, if they hurt their feet, they were dead potentially. So they didn't have refrigerators. They had to be on the move all the time looking for food. But yeah, I think, there's a lesson here, and it's broader than just footwear. I mean, shoes are amazing technology, right? Because they allow you to go much faster, much further than in bare feet. So they serve their purpose, and they protect you from heat and cold and thumbtacks and broken glass. And they can also give you better traction than bare feet in some circumstances. But there's always a cost to technology. It may be a small cost, but it's not a zero cost. And one of the things I believe in very deeply is we need to be very mindful about technology in our lives. And one of the things that worries me is sometimes I see among other people, or I imagine it, this technology as religion. Technology is going to save us. Just more technology is the answer to every problem, even if it was caused by technology. And I feel like I don't see where that path goes without having that connection to nature too. When you have that connection to nature, then you can start to judge and say, okay, am I better off with or without shoes for this experience, or whatever other technology, we're talking about.
Okay, I see where you're going with that, or how you're explaining that. Tell me about how this overlaps with your day job, because in your Wall Street background, finance world, you're working for, I believe, for a large mortgage servicer right now. All of that is a world that is very, very dependent on technology.
Oh, yeah.
Every minute of every day. So Is nature an escape for you from that? Or how does that, blend in your life?
So, you know, escape is one word, refuge is another word.
I like
Uh,
that.
the balance is another word that people use. I'm a writer, so I'm always struggling with what's the right word. I'm reading Nassim Taleb's book right now, Anti-Fragility.
Yeah, that's a good
And
one.
he talks about a barbell strategy.
Hmm.
So that's sort of where I'm leaning right now. So work, yes, is high tech, but it's mindfulness because we spend money on technology when we believe it's going to produce a return, a positive return. So that's what I mean actually about a mindful approach to technology. And right now we're pushing all of our people to use AI just to become familiar with the tools. And in our call centers, that's becoming, just a revolutionary application for managing, large numbers of customer interactions. But then I go home and I'm like, why do I need more technology when I'm home? Is this going to be my whole life? Am I going to live my life like a spreadsheet? Right.
Mm.
And the answer is, for me, anyhow, no. So, by the way, work is the only place now where I wear shoes. So I do wear shoes at work, part of the team uniform. But otherwise, no, I want direct connection with the natural world. I want the intensity, the contrast, the variety, the stimuli, the challenges. I want the hot and the cold. I do not want to be operating in a controlled climate, high productivity, office cubicle environment for my entire life. That's to me not a fulfilling life.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up that book. That was one that has informed my
Mhm,
view of even trail running. The idea of it, the surface is so uneven
mhm,
that my ankles, my lower legs, my hips, all of it has become stronger
Yep.
because the path is not smooth. And I think that's a lot of his thesis is the more unsmooth you can make things, the more anti-fragile it
Right.
becomes. And I even within my work using the barbell idea, screw diversification,
Hmm.
go to the ends. And
Right.
and so I see that in the way you're describing your life. Your work and your not work is very two ends of a spectrum that whether it's balance or refuge, I can see what you're describing now. It make it, I guess, are you any less present in one versus the other? Like when you're at work, are you ready to go to the other side of the barbell, or how does your mindfulness work in these two extremes?
Well, part of how I thought about it, by the way, the refuge is a quote from Edward Abbey. I don't know if you've read
Hmm.
his Desert Solitaire, but he wrote about, the Southwest and is one of the great nature writers of the 20th century. And I'll misquote him, but he said, without the refuge of wilderness, people living in the cities would be driven to, drugs, crime, and psychotherapy. And I think that is a concern about a fully digital, fully high tech, and not satisfying environment. But on the other hand, there is a reality we have to feed ourselves, and there's 8 billion people, so we're not going to revert to authentic Paleolithic
Yeah.
hunter gatherer lifestyles, or that's not really feasible. So you've got to make decisions, and you've got to be pragmatic about how you make those decisions. So the refuges idea is interesting to me. It's like I can retreat from the high tech world, rearm, refit, refuel, re-energize, and then go back into it. And so it's that I think it's that's part of the barbell is how do you operate in both modes. But what I was going to say, actually, I'm thinking about another writer, John Burroughs, and he wrote about going back to nature to be healed and soothed. And that's another common theme you hear, but also to have his senses put in tune once again. So I do think about nature not just as a refuge, but as a way to reset and level set. And part of nature is idyllic and part of it is painful, right?
Yeah.
So you go to nature and you get stuck in a snowstorm and you're post holing, through 2 or 3 feet of snow. And you're like, I really wish I was back in the office, right? Or you're sitting in the office and it's boring and you're like, it's a nice, beautiful fall day. Why aren't I outside? So what my goal in some of the projects I've been doing is to sort of make sure I'm recharged with the energy and the excitement and the contrast and the joy and the pain of nature, and then bring that mindset back to the digital world and make sure I'm engaged and passionate about that experience as well.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that you have your digital world and you have your analog world? That
You could mhm. you could use that again. That's the two ends of the barbell.
yeah. So,
That would be another metaphor for that.
and you have, it seems like slowly and intentionally built that into your life. Was, I'm always curious, was outdoor pursuits something that you grew up with? Was it part of the DNA of your family, or was that something you figured out later on?
I mean, I would say no, but a little bit of yes. So I grew up in Chicago, so in an urban environment, and so not really. But we did go on vacations in the summer. And so when I was about 12, we went to New Hampshire and we all hiked up Mount Jefferson.
Mm.
And we would have been, unprepared hikers with blue jeans and not enough water, no maps, no compasses. But I remember that. I was talking about that experience with my mom. So that's 50 years ago. And I
Mm.
still remember it. So I think that was a formative experience. And by the time I got to college, I was like, I want to do Outward Bound and go to Colorado. I don't know where that came from, but I think that Mount Jefferson vacation was formative. And that's why I'm a big believer, as I'm sure you are, Josh, and many of your listeners, if not all, that getting kids some experience in the outdoors is essential because it could be that little seed that grows over time and becomes an important part of their life. So growing up, no, nothing special besides those couple, that vacation and a couple other similar episodes.
So I want to get into the pain and suffering side of what you find in nature, but I think there may be a tie somewhere in your history. You end up in the Army. So
That's right.
how did that happen?
Well, I mean, in college, I had that Outward Bound experience, and I was looking around at what to do, and somehow the idea of sitting behind a desk or going on to graduate school was just unappealing. And the military was interesting to me. I was interested in doing something patriotic and serving my country, but I sort of debated between the Air Force and being a fighter pilot because that looked cool. But then I thought, well, but it also seems sort of technical. And maybe being in the Army, being out in the woods, that seemed more appealing to me. That's probably not a good reason to join the Army, since there's obviously other things going on. But I think that was part of the pull of nature expressing itself in a sort of strange way.
Okay. Where did you go to school?
I went to Yale for undergraduate.
Yale. And
Yeah.
did you go straight into the Army after graduation?
I did. But by the way, when the mountains, I would say I had an experience where the mountains literally called to me as if it was a radio signal, with some kind of code.
Was it while you were in college?
No, that was age 50.
Oh, wow.
So, but after business school, I went on a mountain climbing trip, and then gradually I got into running and discovered trail running. So the mountains were calling throughout my life. The funny thing is, it took, even for somebody like me with running and hiking and some outdoors experience, it took until age 50 that I actually heard them. And so I think the good news is for all of us that nature calls. The natural stimuli, they unlock something inside us. That's where we come from. And so nature is always there for us. But the bad news is the digital environment is so loud, so distracting. There's so many pressures that we put on ourselves and other people put on us that it's easy to miss it. And so what you're doing with your podcast, what I'm trying to do with some of the things that I do, is just help a few more people wake up and hear that call so they can hear it and think about it and do something about it.
Yeah, that highlights something that I've been thinking of just in the last week or two. I heard an entrepreneur talking about the idea of signal versus noise. And he was talking in the context of being a business leader and successful entrepreneur and, cutting out the things that distract so you can focus on the things that allow you to succeed. But in another conversation just yesterday, the idea was there's many, many more contexts that this signal versus noise comparison can be applied to. And I hadn't even thought about it the way you just described it, that nature is sending the signal
Right.
constantly, but the noise is so loud from all the other sources
Right.
that it drowns it out. And like any other signal versus noise attempt, we have to find the attention, I think,
Right.
the attention on the signal to be able to cut out the noise and ignore it. So how did,
Except it's much worse. It's much worse than that, Josh.
okay.
Because the signal noise, that's information theory. That's Claude Shannon's theory from 70 years ago or whenever. And we're natural. The brain is naturally looking for signal and patterns. The problem in the digital environment, and it's the problem of all social environments, is that we've got a lot of people who are trying to create signals.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of it's very obvious. It's marketing, and then there's propaganda, and then there's the priestly class, and no offense to priests, and then there's the media, which is sort of today's priestly class. And I think part of the challenge for all of us, because we're social creatures and we want to get along and help other people, but when you have 8 billion peers and they all have an opinion about what you should be doing and saying and thinking and wearing, and who you should be voting for and what products you should be buying, what flavor toothpaste, I think that creates noise, and that makes it hard for people. I think that's what drowns out, where the risk is that drowns out the call of nature. I've read a lot of race reports, and people talk about the voice of self-doubt, the self-critical voice. And what's interesting, Freud wrote about this a long time ago, and he said that's the guilty conscience which internalizes what everybody else thinks you should be doing. And it's sort of like, no, Josh, no, Ken. Ken, put your shoes back on. That's not what you're supposed to be doing. Go back and do your job. Right? So that's part of the challenge, I think, for all of us.
So what was different about 50 that allowed you to hear the signal that you hadn't heard before?
That's an interesting question. I had just finished a 9-day through run. I ran on the long path and went out to set a fastest known time and was able to do so. That was a huge experience. And I think maybe that created a little bit of stillness in my life. I have a theory that our ancestors had quieter lives than we do. That's just a theory. I wasn't around in hunter-gatherer time, so I don't actually know. And they had their aggravations and their challenges. But I have a theory is that one way you get the noise to drown out is by, using your body. So I did have an experience a couple of years ago. I went and through hiked the John Muir Trail.
Okay.
And I did it barefoot. And it was very difficult. By the time I got to the end of it, I remember I got down I finally put my shoes on the top of Mount Whitney, which is the end of the John Muir Trail, the southern terminus. And I made the 6,000 feet or 8,000 feet descent into the portal, and then got a ride down into Lone Pine and walked into the Dow Villa Motel, and I was like, do you have a room? They did have a room. It didn't have any air conditioning, but they had a room. So I went to a restaurant, picked some food, went to sleep, couldn't sleep. My feet hurt a lot. But the next day, I realized the world had become totally still and quiet. And I was having breakfast, eating a taco or something, and the sun was rising over the Inyo Mountains. And this is a big desert valley with Mount Whitney on one side and Death Valley a couple valleys over. And for a day, the world became very quiet and still. So I did, maybe to answer your question, just the 9-day through run of the long path, it created some stillness. Maybe that's what it takes in our world to really be able to hear those signals.
And you found that's really interesting. You found that through pushing your body physically through something very difficult to only find the stillness on the other side.
But by the way, I'll jump in and I'll pitch barefoot as a shortcut to the signal of nature. And here's my theory, and it's not scientific. Nobody's proved it. Nobody ever will. By the way, science is part of the noise, of course. Science is part of the great technology we have, but it's also part of the noise. But, people talk about grounding and the psychological benefits of barefoot as if there were ions and electrical forces. And maybe there are. I have no idea. But I have a simpler theory, which is a large portion of the brain is there to move the body over rough terrain. including soft, naked feet. And when that part of the mind is engaged, it's, like I said, the original human mindfulness. And you're operating the body the way it evolved, over millions and millions of years to operate, including our animal ancestors, right? When you put on shoes, you block out the signal. That part of the brain has nothing or less to do. And if it has not less to do, it starts to, fuss about social media and the headlines and the politicians you can't stand and your spouse who's giving you a hard time. So I do think that barefoot is and it's been historically associated with spiritual practices, and not to overhype this, but I think it engages the mind and creates some stillness particularly as you move through, rough, wild terrain.
That's very interesting, and I can see how that would work. As you know, I think maybe some debate between whether the human brain can really multitask or not. But I think of my attention as like a spotlight in a direction. And so what you're saying is, and I can get this. Like if I'm walking down the street without shoes on, that spotlight is on one thing. Like don't step on the nail. Don't watch out for snakes. And it's not, the attention doesn't skew to anything else that is going on around me or maybe happening at home or online. Like none of that matters.
So here's a thought for your listeners. The Born to Run was, I think the best-selling running book of all time. But it talked about getting into barefoot running. Mm-hmm. Barefoot running requires a transition. It's a subtly different geometry, if you will. And if you do it too quickly, you can injure yourself. But barefoot walking or hiking does not, in my experience and seeing other people, I don't think it takes a whole lot of transition. I think you can really go hit the trail tomorrow for something short, mm-hmm. and you can build up pretty quickly. As long as you're willing to move slowly, you can build up reasonably quickly. I just took a group, we had about 10 people, and we did about, maybe 3 or 4 miles total. And there were some younger folks, and they just shot ahead. And then there were some older folks, and they were a little bit surprised because mm-hmm. The barefoot does require balance. You can't go jumping around and slipping and tumbling. So it does require more control. And for some of the older folks, they were moving a little bit slower. But you go into this practice for the physical and psychological benefits and, not necessarily for speed.
Yeah. So I'm sure you have people ask you how to do this. Do you have a suggested protocol for how someone would go from big comfy shoes with giant soles to going barefoot in whatever they want to do?
Yeah, and I think the simplest way is just to start walking, like, a local park, mm-hmm. right? You don't have to walk into a fancy department store and see what happens. Just try your local park. And if somebody asks you, I think the biggest challenge is people are self-conscious and they don't want to do something different. If somebody asks you, say you're grounding. Because a lot of times when I go around without shoes, people say, "Oh, you're grounding."
They already assume.
Exactly. People get it. They know that it's good for you and that it's fun, but most people are not going to try it. But you could experiment in your local park. Just walk around a little bit and don't do too much too quickly. That's, give your body time to adapt and listen to your body and see what your feet think. And your feet might tell you, hey, we need to do more of this, or they might tell you, hey, dude, put those shoes right back on. We're all different, but it's a very accessible path for almost everybody who's open to a little bit of exploring.
So that's the attention side, and I really like that as it's not a hack or shortcut, but it seems like that would be a guaranteed way to bring mindfulness into what you're doing. Yeah. The suffering side of what you have experienced, and suffering also has a way of bringing your attention onto one thing. But tell me a little bit more and maybe some stories around some of these ultra distance events that you've done and experienced this in. But tell me more about what you have experienced through suffering and learned from that.
Right. Well, this might be the end of our conversation because I'll quote Haruki Murakami, who's the famous Japanese novelist, and he's also a marathon runner. And he's repeating the same cliche that everybody says. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. So pain, we learn about reality through pleasure and pain. And Josh, think about a regression plot, not to bore your listeners with statistics, but you can draw a line through a cluster of dots and see a relationship. But if all the dots are in the same place, there's no variation, right? And it's boring. And it's boring because there's no information there. So we want pain and pleasure.
Right.
Now, suffering is when you whine to yourself about how bad things are, right? In the Army, we used to say, suck it up, buttercup.
Yeah.
And look, I want to be respectful. There are people out there that have true challenges, illness, poverty, hunger, criminal, bullies, war. So, probably you and I are not, and most of, middle-class people are not suffering with that level of challenge, but there are people who have faced those challenges and they face them with confidence and with, to the extent possible, a positive attitude and a pragmatic attitude, and they pay attention to the risks, and they do their best they can for themselves and their families. So let's just be careful about suffering, but the pain is very important. We don't want to live a shielded existence where, like, imagine if you only had ice cream, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You never have the pain of spinach or liver or whatever you don't like, or broccoli, right? That would be pretty boring and pretty terrible pretty quickly. So it's the contrast that's important. Suffering, it's interesting. You learn in ultra marathons that self-talk is very important, how you talk to yourself. And you can take pain and make it suffering by saying, oh, I'm tired, I'm hungry, I'm tired. But you can also say, hey, look, I'm slowing down. Let's diagnose what's going on. I do feel fatigue. I don't have enough calories. Okay. Problem, diagnosis, now action plan, right? Get more calories, right? Or if they're not available, then pace yourself. Nobody starved to death in a 50-mile race. So just move slowly and keep moving until you can get to that next aid station or whatever. So yeah, I think the self-talk is really important.
That's very helpful to bring the distinction between pain and suffering, that they don't necessarily have to be the same thing. And I would agree with you, especially in these adventure pursuits that I talk to people about doing all the time. For the most part, these are chosen, right? These are chosen pursuits. But you're getting to the idea, though, that pain is going to be there, and it can be your teacher rather than your oppressor. And have you always had an understanding of that? Was that something you took out of Army training, or was that developed as you spent more and more time doing long distance things?
Yeah, and I want to pivot back to suffering. I don't want to come across as just a totally unsympathetic, asshole. But for an adventure, suffering is, there can be bad outcomes. But I think suffering to me is more about there's something wrong with my life. And so I don't mean to be, skeptical or dismissive of that. And, Thoreau wrote one of his most famous phrases. He said, the majority of men live lives of quiet desperation. And so that's sort of, I think, when I think of suffering, I think of a low energy state where people don't have the goals or clarity on the goals that are going to create the energy. So, the suffering is not to be dismissed or belittled. So the suck it up buttercup is about, execute your mission in the moment, but it's not about, it doesn't mean that you don't need to think through your life. I think the training is a discipline and a path, not only to getting to the end, the finish line, but also to developing those self-management skills that you can hopefully apply to the other parts of your life that are much more complicated, like relationships, jobs, politics, the economy, whatever, all the problems you're trying to figure out. And hopefully these pragmatic skills can be helpful there too.
Yeah, I've seen that in a lot of these conversations of where, there's a reason people get or a path that leads them to the adventure, but as they do more and more of the hard things, that it develops a resilience, it develops an ability to take pain on board for an extended period of time. And then when things happen outside of the adventure, they now have that tool in the toolbox to be able to apply it in some other context. I'm thinking of one story. I have not interviewed this guy, but I'm blanking on his name. World-class runner, big outdoor runner, and came down with some really bad medical condition that almost killed him. He was in the hospital for months, and Rich Roll interviewed him just on the backside of coming out of the hospital. And he made a comment that a line that kept rolling through his head while he was in the hospital was, "I don't want to waste the suffering." And that there was something to be learned and applied even, and in that case, it was maybe even with the definition we're talking about, that was suffering. But my point is that he had done so many hard things up to that point that had to help inform and support the thing that he could never have expected to come into his life.
Yeah. And by the way, I was just thinking about Cheryl Strayed's book, Lost, about her hike on the Pacific Coast Trail. And a lot of times people will go to an adventure type challenge because they are struggling or suffering with something else in their life. And it's like we use these training modes to reset and also rediscover our agency. I think a lot of spiritual traditions are about personal agency, because again, back to that point, we have 8 billion peers. They all have opinions on what we should be doing. And, we want to help our peers and do good things, but we want to take control and make those decisions and not be buffeted and steered. And so I think the training is super key to that. The Yurok tribe of Indians in Northwest California, they have a traditional form of training called Kep. And it involves fasting and going without water and, hanging out in the sweat lodges and then going out in the trails. And in times gone by, it was described as a path for obtaining spiritual powers from the spirit world. But also people describe it as building yourself, building your mental strength so that you can achieve your purpose in life and not be somebody else's pet. So that's the word that sometimes gets used. So a lot of what we're trying to do, I think, is just get our hands on the controls.
Yeah, I like that. That does seem like a healthy outcome from doing these things that, again, a lot of people maybe look at what you've done and say, why would somebody ever do that? And, I'll get to this in a second, but you have done some fairly extreme pursuits. And I think I know to some extent why you have done it. But it's also this idea I repeat a lot of, as human beings, as animals, we generally don't do things unless there's a reward. There's got to be some sort of thing that we get from doing it. So I think even up to this point, you've done a really good job of explaining what the thing on the other side of a pain and difficulty and doing something in the same direction for a really long time, what the reward of that is. It's not a medal. It's not a finish line. It's not even saying that you can do something. It's something a little more, I think, intangible, a tool that we put in the toolbox. So I would like to, if there's anything else you want to add there, but I do want to also ask you some questions around your Badwater Double and then get to your pursuit of the grid in the Catskills. But before we kind of shift into that, is there anything else around kind of the transcendental or spiritual pursuit of being in nature that you'd throw in there while we're talking about it?
No, I would summarize. I like to make things simple. The transcendentalist path it's about getting better, right? And it's about getting better at being yourself. So that's how I'd leave it. And I think that is its own reward, and it creates enormous energy. And I think when I look around, I sometimes wonder if people have as much energy as they would like. Or maybe they do, and it's just different for me. Yeah.
So as I mentioned this a second ago, the Badwater Double, how long ago was that you did that?
Well, my ultra credentials are starting to get a little bit rusty. So that was 2014.
Okay, not that long ago.
Yeah. It's just like a long time ago. By the way, you've heard about Bob Becker.
Yeah.
You should get him on your podcast. He obviously is the oldest person to finish Badwater at age 80. And he had Marshall Ulrich and Lisa Smith-Batchen on his crew, and Marshall has been a huge inspiration to me. Lisa was my coach
Oh, wow.
when I ran the Badwater race back in the day. So they're amazing, amazing people.
That's cool. Those are names that I've heard of, but I've had no reason to cross paths with them either. So that'd be a really cool conversation. He just finished again, did he not?
Well, he finished this year at age 80, and 3 years ago he had failed at age 77. He had just missed the cutoff, and I know him a little bit from some past activities, and I reached out to him, and he mentioned that his back was bothering him, and a back is a challenge when it's not 100%. So he crossed the finish line like 17 minutes late, and he was like, "I'm never doing this again." But if you hang around with Marshall and Lisa, maybe they were whispering in his ear, but his training felt good, and he came back and he got it done with 3 hours to spare. So a decisive,
wow,
a
that's a
decisive
big
finish.
swing.
Yeah,
that is a big swing. So, explain to folks what Badwater is.
So Badwater is a tradition, really. Now there's a race, but it started in the 1970s. A guy named Al Arnold just came up with this crazy idea to go from the lowest place in the country, i.e. the Badwater Basin in Death Valley at 289 feet below sea level, to the highest point in the continental US, which is the summit of Mount Whitney at 14,500 feet. And he has a funny quote. He said that in a past life, he must have been a scout. And you could just drop him anywhere and he would figure his way out. So that was sort of his mentality. And I think it took him 3 tries, and he finally made the crossing in the 70s, and that inspired a race, which has been now around for a long time. The Badwater Double just consists of, the traditional route is to the top of Whitney. The race stops at the portal because you can't get a permit for 100 people to go up to the top. It would overcrowd the terrain. So that's the race. The double is the traditional route to the summit and then all the way back to the basin. So it's 290, I think, 2 miles. And by the way, Marshall and Lisa have both done the Badwater Quad, which is.
Oh my gosh, are you serious?
Yeah, absolutely. That's 584 or whatever miles it is. By the way, I aspired to do the quad, and we'll get to this, but
Okay.
At that point in my running career, by the way, the double, I was 51 years old. That was the best run of my life. It went, I don't want to say perfectly, there were challenges, but I had a strategy. I was in great shape. I had a great crew, and I encountered some challenges, but I was able to pivot and get it done. And as far as I know, I still have the record for the doubles, whatever it is, 92 hours or something. But after that, I had pushed my body maybe a little bit too far, and I began to struggle with a few injuries. So that was the last of my notable ultra running, although I've still continued to do ultra runs and marathons and other things.
Yeah, and I mean, I would still say the long distance hiking that you're doing is no easy feat or short feat either. But the double, and just to be clear, you went from Death Valley up to Mount Whitney, and then turned around and went all the way back.
That's right.
And then this is in one push.
That's correct. I took, I had like a total of 4 hours of breaks of sleeping along the way over 4 days. Now that was a crewed or a supported run, so I had a crew, and they would meet me every couple miles with water and food and other things. But yes, it was one push because the clock did not stop ticking.
Is this a race that you did barefoot?
No.
Because I've heard of the asphalt gets so hot it melts the soles of a running shoe, so you have to run on the white strip. And
I think that's a little bit apocryphal. My shoes didn't melt. I didn't see anybody else's. It gets hot out there, But the first time I got interested in Badwater, and by the way, one of the points I was going to make is the importance of goals, right?
Yeah, that's great.
And the goals have got to be stretch goals. I mean, if you can't do them, they have no purpose. And if they're too easy, they just don't get you excited. And I remember thinking about when I first heard about Badwater, it's crazy, right? Running through the desert, 120 degrees or whatever. But then I thought, you have a long time to do it. You could take your time and walk during the heat of the day and run at night. And all of a sudden I had a glimmer of how to approach this seemingly impossible task. And that's what really got me hooked. So, you could, I suppose, do it barefoot by just holding up, hiding under a bush or something during the worst part of the day. By the way, that's a problem. I was just in the San Gabriels outside LA doing some hiking. And, there's nothing worse than like if you're going north uphill and the sun is behind you in the south and you get the aspect of the trail causes it to receive the sun's rays very directly, and the sand gets hot.
Oh, yeah.
So I struggled there, and I struggled on the John Muir Trail. So I'm not planning to do Badwater barefoot, but I suppose you could figure out a way to do it, possibly.
So you did it with shoes on, which is still amazing. But was this a time, were there any other runners out there, or was it just you and your crew?
We just went out by ourselves. We went out in the early part of July. The standards for the traditional double, you have to start in the morning. Now the race starts in the evening, so we just did it. We just did it away from the race.
I gotcha. So you picked July. I'm assuming that's
You have no choice. July or August are your two options for the traditional route and record.
Is that because it needs to be as extreme as possible?
Yes.
Or is there some? Okay, all right. So July or August, and do you have a sense of how many people have actually tried this?
I don't remember the number. There are others who have done this. The quad, only a handful have done, but the double, I don't know, 20 or 30 or 40 probably.
And how do you get in shape and prepared to not only run, what was it, almost 300 miles, but to survive it and do it at a decent time?
Well, I would say this was coming for me after years of gradually building up. So when I turned 40, as we were talking and saw people at work getting sick and figured I needed to start investing myself, I started doing marathons and then gradually pushed up over the next 10 years to 50K, 50 mile, 100 mile, 135. And, today people are doing 200 and 250 mile races and, fastest known times on the 3,000 mile Appalachian Trail. So
yeah.
The human body, if it's operated properly, can go really long distances.
It's amazing.
Apparently.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Which of the things that you've done, race or non-race, would you say has been your favorite?
Whatever I did yesterday. It's funny. I've got all my finishers medals from ultra marathons and 5Ks, and they're in 2 boxes in my garage. But I'm thinking of taking over the dining room table and just laying them out. And, they're little trinkets that nobody in the world cares about. Not even me, but each of them has meaning about a day where I did something simple, but got it done.
Yeah.
And so without answering your question, because I can't think of a single, it's the collection. It's the lifetime.
That's a really cool answer.
Yeah, and it's like the runner's high is not, in the middle of the run. The runner's high is at the end of the run, and then you go on to the next run, and then the runner's high is your life. And you live in a life with energy and excitement. And my theory is that's how people are supposed to live. That's how life's supposed to be. But you can get pushed into a low energy state in today's world because there's so many people, screaming at you. All the time. Which I think is a shame.
So when you finished the Badwater Double, what was that feeling in that moment like?
Well, I mean, I crossed the finish line. We drove back to the hotel. I fell asleep. I think we had dinner. I don't remember. The next morning I got up and I felt great.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Like your body was ready to keep moving, go?
I was listening to somebody talking about this, and there's type 1 fun, type 2 fun, and maybe type 3 fun. And sometimes the ultra marathons do turn into, notwithstanding everything I just said, they do turn into suffer fests because you have problems. You got to aggressively manage problems, and it's in the moment not so much fun. But if you're in really good shape and you execute the mission well and things go well, it's an amazing feeling to run a marathon or a 50-mile race or 100 miles, whatever it is, and have it go well. As I get older, that's less. I call them survivathons now. But for me, the double was one of those events where the mission was successful, and it was successful for all the right reasons.
Yeah.
There were some challenges. I mean, towards the end, coming back into the valley, Death Valley, there were ferocious headwinds. Like I have a video somewhere, my shirt's just flapping.
Wow.
So a 30 or 40 mile an hour headwinds. And I didn't feel like I could run. And I started hallucinating about like bicycles. Like if I got a
Is that
bicycle, would that still count for the record?
right?
And I had some great pacers, including Deanna Culbreth, and she said, "Come on, let's try running." And I was like, "All right, well," and I couldn't talk at that point. I
Is that
really
right?
couldn't talk because, after 4 days, my cognitive processing capabilities were degraded, so to speak. But I was like, okay, if she runs, I'll try running too. And it felt so hard, like the hardest thing I had ever done in my life. But I also realized, hey, my heart's not exactly racing and I'm not out of breath. So it's actually not physically hard. It's just the system is struggling.
Mm-hmm.
But I found that if I made a huge effort, I could keep moving and I could trot along at, a 12-minute pace or something and keep up with Deanna. And so that was a huge lesson that sometimes if you can really make the effort, you will keep moving. And that's the lesson of life. And it's not just people, it's not just runners or people, it's, animals
Yeah.
too, and maybe plants in their way. That's just what we do. We
Yes.
try to do our job and grow and reproduce or whatever. And you can do more than we can all do more than we think.
Regardless of what the brain is trying to convince us of, the body can sometimes, not always, but many
Yeah.
times continue to push and one foot in front of the other. So you have a new book coming out, and I want to give us a little bit of space here to talk about that. And it's called Chasing the Grid. Is that correct?
That's right. And it picks up where the Badwater Double leaves off, because after
Okay.
the Badwater Double, I was, as you can imagine, fired up and looking for my next challenge. And I discovered a challenge in the Catskills, and I bit off, I don't want to give away the plot, but I bit off more than I realized.
Oh, this is massive. Yeah.
And so the book is it's sort of about a pivot, because here I was, the Badwater Double record setter, and I was gonna, break every other record on the East Coast. But at the same time, I was getting older. And so I had sort of I don't want to call it a crisis, because I was just, going suck it up, buttercups. So like, hey, dude, look in the mirror. But at work, work things were sort of leveling off at work, right? And then I hit these injuries, which began to constrain my running. And so my barbell was starting to not work very well, or it wasn't generating energy on either end, if you will. And I realized, hey, this is what Thoreau was talking about. All these people who don't run, and that's me now, at least while I was dealing with these problems. So I made a pivot. I discovered peak bagging, which is just hiking up mountains, and you can do it in any mountain range, and you can go slowly. It's not a race. It's a quantity of peaks you have to accumulate. So it's a different structure. And it's not a race, it's more like a pilgrimage. But it was a great pivot, because once I had this new project, which fit my circumstances at the time, all the energy came racing back. And so that's why I like to say the right projects can generate so much energy. And then you can fly through life on afterburners and get a lot of stuff done, maybe. So it became but I would say, the pilgrimage is also a slightly different concept. It's the idea that you can go off in a different direction and learn something and come back and be a little bit different.
Yeah.
And so the project had a lot of impact on me for whatever reasons. It put me onto a super minimalist route, which includes the barefoot. And the changes appear to be permanent, because, today, several years later, I'm still doing more or less the same things.
So are there other things that it changed in your approach to being outdoors other than just wearing bare feet?
Well, I mean, other minimalist approaches would be like cold exposure, and Wim Hof is the great guru for that. So I did, nothing special, but I did some hikes and runs with, shirtless. I stopped carrying food and in many cases water. So that started, a fasting practice that I continue to this day. I experimented with other things like natural navigation, so going bushwhacking or going off
Okay.
trail through the forest without using maps and compass or GPS to see if you can, see your way through the forest instead of following, back to the discussion of technology.
Hmm.
And, silly things like stumbling around at night without lights and even not using bug spray. So it was a strange experience in that as the mountains called to me, they seemed to say, "Hey, rediscover your human strengths."
Hmm.
Right? Back off on technology, use it where you need it, but focus on making yourself, your underlying human strengths stronger. That's how you'll discover who you really are. And so this is where I really sort of, without having read Taleb's book on anti-fragility, this is where I started to work on this side of the barbell is really a permanent part of my life.
Gotcha. And what have you learned about yourself, or maybe the true self that was not quite coming out? What have you learned about that through being in the mountains?
I would say that the big project there was to discover the mountains and the joy and energy and pain in the mountains, and then sort of reset myself and bring that energy back to the rest
Hmm.
of my life. So I thought about it as a project of integration. So
That's
it's
cool.
so not about running away from the modern world to nature, but bringing nature back into the modern world. And
Gotcha.
there's some other things in the book which you can read and your listeners can decide what they think. I encountered my my inner demon, and I came face to face with my, ego, or
Hmm.
it felt like that. Because when you're in the mountains, there's a more primitive sense of self potentially. The noise dies down. The
Hmm.
social you don't hopefully bring the social
Hmm.
media with you, and it gets quiet, and you start to hear little voices and whispers and get hints of images that are maybe bubbling up from different parts of your mind. They tend to get drowned out in the day to day.
Yeah.
And I
So,
feel I feel like that's really important. And Josh, you made a comment about the spotlight, the flashlight.
yeah.
And the flashlight lights up what you're shining at, and everything else is cast in darkness. And the California Indians have a saying which resonates with me. They said that their shamans learned to see the second night that lies behind the darkness that the rest of us perceive, and that the spirit world would send animals as messengers to help them with their spells. And so that has stuck with me. And it's the idea about outside of the flashlight, there's a lot of us outside of the flashlight. And so putting yourself out in nature on one of these challenging adventures, it might give you a chance to start to perceive from outside of the flashlight, particularly if
That's
your
cool.
flashlight starts to run low on batteries and flickers.
Yeah, that is really cool. Now, you've talked about nature almost from a human characteristic, like personification of nature as a being, and in the way that you've interacted with it. These parts or other characters that showed up out there, what was that like? Was it, oh my gosh, this is really scary, or was it more, oh, there you are, kind of not a welcome appearance, but not a surprising thing? Where did it fit for you when that was going on?
Quiet. In my experience, and now some people have, hallucinogenic visions, but for me, the voices and images are quiet and faint.
Hmm.
And there's a really interesting book by what's his name, Julian James, I think it is, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And it's a great theory. It's the ultimate unprovable theory. But his theory is that, quote unquote, primitive people, say 700 BC or whatever, that they literally experienced at difficult points in their life. They did literally made decisions on the basis of auditory hallucinations. So voices in their minds of the gods telling them what to do. It's the impossible theory because you can't go back in time and ask people or look inside their heads. And he makes the point that, since then the conscious mind through learning and language and everything else has gotten so overpowering that people lost that direct connection to the gods. And so they had to have priests do divinations and other ceremonies to, hopefully restore that connection. So in my experience, these, and you could use a different language. You could talk about, Jungian archetypes, patterns in our minds from the ancestral unconscious or whatever. But these images are faint in my experience. And that's why that to me is one of the benefits of being outdoors for, large periods of time and pushing yourself physically to tire out, the brain or get the brain focused away from distractions. That's what sets the stage for these little interesting ideas and things that, that's part of the creative process, possibly.
And you said this a minute ago, part of your work is to take those experiences and integrate that back into your day-to-day life. So what does that look like?
Well, I think the first thing is just the energy. Because I used to find as a young person that, sitting around like at meals and talking was for me not very engaging. I need to get my heart rate moving a little bit more to really generate the positive energy. And I think once you have that positive energy, it makes being around other people more fun. It makes a person more engaging. Sometimes when I'm out walking or running, sometimes I am thinking about work problems and an idea pops up. And sometimes it's personal challenges. And sometimes there's an image or an idea, just a little quiet voice that says, what about this?
That's very cool. So the title's Chasing the Grid. What is the grid? Why don't you explain that for folks listening?
So the grid is a peak bagging challenge. And the traditional peak bagging challenge is, for example, in the Catskills, there are 35 high peaks or 33, depending on how you count them. And just somebody said, hey, there's a list of peaks and you should go climb them all. And if you do, you get a certificate and a patch. And you can do this in the Catskills, in the Adirondacks, in New Hampshire, in Vermont. I think it did start in the Northeast.
Okay.
You can do the Colorado, I think there are 58 mountains over 14,000 feet. That's a more substantial challenge. The mountains in the Catskills are 3,500 to 4,000 feet. So anywhere there's a list of mountains, you can take it to the next level of doing a grid, which requires you to do the list in each month of the year. And it doesn't have to be 1 year. You can take as long as you want. But in the Catskills, it's 35 peaks times 12 months is 420. So it's not like some kind of super ultra marathon endurance challenge, but it is a big project. And sometimes people will go out and do it in a year. That would be very hard with a job or a family. Yeah. But it's a project that you can stretch out over time. And it's a project that is meaningful because that quantity produces just so much insight about the mountains and yourself that it's like, a multi-year learning project.
Just by nature of the amount of time that you have to spend out there to accomplish the thing.
And plus the mountains are different. Each of the mountains is different in each month. They're different in each month of the year. Obviously there's snow and ice in the winter, the fall foliage, the heat and the bugs in the summer and sort of the rainy mud in the spring. So you see them at all points of year, all times of the year. And it does force you to, again, it's not a endurance challenge, but it forces you to get out there in whatever season you don't like. I like the summer. I mean, part of the reason I did well at Badwater, I think I'm more naturally heat resistant than cold resistant. I do not particularly like snowshoeing, but it forces you out there. And, if you want to get it done, you got to get out there and do it. And it's a large quantity of projects. And I had this attitude that, this is important. I'm learning about myself. I need to get it done while I have the time and energy. So I pushed myself pretty hard, but even took a year off from work to finish it up because I realized I'd saved, the worst for last. So I had, out of 420, I had 100 left to do, but they were all in the winter.
Okay.
So I was like, this is going to need some extra time.
So it's funny. I'm opposite of you, where I really do not feel like I function very well in the heat, and being in the South in the summer, it
Right.
feels like it's 1,000,000 degrees and 1,000,000 degrees percent humidity every single day. And at the end of every run, I'm like wringing out buckets of sweat. But being in the winter in negative temperatures is great. Feel like I could go all day long. So I interviewed a guy that did the Iditarod 1,000 race.
Oh, wow.
And he actually won it several years ago.
Oh, cool.
And just that's a different kind of cold. So,
That's a serious cold.
Yeah. Alaska in February is a very serious cold. So, but yeah, that's interesting to have a goal where you can't sandbag it. I mean, if you have to hit it every single month, you're going to get the full experience. Have there been has there been weather so extreme or conditions so extreme where you couldn't do the trail?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I had, I usually go out with A goals, B goals, and C goals. And, once I remember, I had this plan. You got to get each of the mountains in each month of the year. So I said, look, I'm going to go out in the evening and do this ridge with 4 peaks. And then I'm going to get to the last one, wait until it's midnight, and then go back. And then I get 8.
In a short period of time. Yeah.
And I got out there, and it was just a little bit of light snow, and I didn't bring my snowshoes. And I got to the top of the first mountain, and it was a steep descent, and it was icy. And I was like, no, I can't go down that. So I said, well, all right, instead of 8, I'll do 2. I'll just stand on this mountain until it's midnight. And I'll get to count it. But then I got cold, and I'm like, I'm not going to stand here for 3 hours.
So it turned into 1?
Out of 8, it turned into 1. That happens a lot to me anyhow, because I look at the map, and before you know it, I'm going to do 20 mountains. I went out in the Catskills just last weekend. It was going to be like, I don't know, 12 mountains, doing a whole, 2-day loop around this valley. And I got out there, and I had never seen so much bindweed before. Some people call it buckwheat. I don't know if you have it down south, but I'm sure you have something like it. It grows on tendrils, and it's a vine, and it tangles everything up.
Oh, okay.
So you see it growing up saplings. And I got into waist-high ferns, and it was all tangled up with bindweed, and I couldn't move. So instead of 12, I did 3 and just got out of there. But, it's like, it's like going through a jungle. And that's one of the challenges of the Catskills. That's changing now, but many of the trails historically many of the peaks did not historically have trails. So you did need to navigate. And, if you pay attention with a GPS, that's not an insurmountable task, but the terrain is very rough, and particularly in the summer, it can be very slow, like 1 mile an hour, or waist-high ferns with bindweed. It might be slower than that because you can't see what you're stepping on, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the challenge. And when you're barefoot, you can't just step on a rock or a stick.
Yeah.
So it starts to get I call that type 3 fun.
Okay. Yeah, that seems like it could go sideways pretty quickly. But you also have described something right there where you've honed the ability to flip a switch when it gets too dangerous, too not the right time. I would imagine that you have honed that decision making over your years of doing all these things.
Yeah, and by the way, in the book, in Chasing the Grid, there's a long run that, again, without spoiling the plot, I have to make, a hard decision. And, that I think one of the points I like to make about being in these sideways kinds of situations, you're practicing, managing yourself, right? And you asked earlier, why have I done so much? And it's probably because I needed to be better. I needed to train myself to be better. There's some people who are already really good, and maybe they don't need this.
They don't need it.
Yeah. But I one of the things I've learned in these sideways situations is the importance of managing what people call cognitive load, right?
Yeah.
So, if you're in a dicey situation, you hopefully have the experience of understanding your body and the different systems in your body, having some knowledge in the environment and where you need to get to, the planning that goes into, even a simple hike in the forest. You can't always do as much planning as you'd like, but the ability to just stop and say, okay, we got to slow things down and be more careful here. Tolerance for mistakes is going down. So like on this hike the other weekend, again, there's nothing dramatic about any of this stuff, but I've got a liter of water and it's hot. And at 1 mile an hour, no, I'm not going to get to a water source until the evening. So that, that's a consideration. And so if I'm going to abort and exit early, instead of staying out for 2 days, going downhill is easier to make mistakes when you're off trail. It's very easy to slip down the side of something, and you don't want to end up in somebody's backyard, or get lost or something like that. So you need to be able to say, okay, we got to slow down. Chuck Yeager is a famous test pilot, and he used to say the riskier things got, the slower I talk. And so that's some of the pragmatic skill set that I think we all develop as we push ourselves into sort of high stress regimes. You just learn to manage yourself, and then hopefully your partner yells at you, or your boss is upset, or the wrong person wins the election, and you're like, okay, just slow down and focus on what I can control right now.
Yeah. So is it how do I want to say this? Is it a cognitive decision that you almost like part of a checklist in those moments that you go, okay, this is the next thing I need to do? I'm just curious kind of what steps you go through to slow yourself down.
Well, I think part of this is just mental strength. So, and the way I think about things, like we talked about earlier, energy comes from goals. So when you have goals, you have enough energy to do anything. I mean, it doesn't mean you can physically do anything, but you also need the mental strength to channel that energy. And nobody knows what mental strength really is, but I don't know that it's any different than physical strength, right? So a bodybuilder goes to the gym and lifts weights and makes themselves physically strong, but it's mind body, because it's a mental effort to lift those barbells or whatever. And so I think a lot of this is practice. So if you do a lot of running, you get used to, hey, I'm half a mile from the finish line, so I can go all out now. And that all out is like lifting the dumbbells to failure.
Yeah.
So I do think it's just, to some extent, just practice.
That's I think a great takeaway for any of our listeners. I've kind of coined all of us as everyday explorers.
Yeah.
Most of us aren't getting paid to go out and do these things that we do in different parts of the world, but there's what I've found is the people that I've interacted that do listen to these, there is an element of wanting to learn. Like, what else is there for me? How can I get better at doing these things? And so hearing your experience and the way you've developed and approached these very difficult things is very helpful. So tell me when the book comes out and where can people buy it?
So it's Chasing the Grid. You can pre-order it on Amazon now, and it's available September 23rd is when it comes out.
All right. That's a good day. That was the day that I came into this world. So
oh, really? Okay.
I will remember that.
Well, Josh, I will send you a birthday present. How about that? I don't want to tell you what
cool.
it is, but
very cool. So what do you have next? I always like to kind of probe this a little bit on the back end of a conversation, and especially for somebody that you've got some really big things on your resume that you have done. What does next look like for you?
Well, when I ran the Leadville 100-mile race, and that was a long time ago, but whenever it was, 2011, I think, Marshall Ulrich was there, and he gave the pre-race briefing, and I was there with my kids who were young at the time, and he said, even as you get older, never stop setting goals. So I took my kids up to meet him afterwards, and I said, thank you, Marshall. That's inspiring. I told my kids, you don't forget what he said. So, and I used to think maybe you get to some point and you retire and then you just kick back, but I don't know. I mean, I feel like to keep doing things, you've got to continue to be strong and disciplined and practice the things that we're all preaching. So I have some goals. Now, I'm not going to just like come out casually on your podcast and say something I would regret later. But I will say Bob Becker's finish at Badwater at age 80. That's very inspiring to me as a young
cool.
62-year-old. That means if I was going to do that, I have 18 years to get ready for it.
Plenty of time. Plenty of time.
So that's got my attention. So, and by the way, that's why you and I and others, talk about this stuff, because when we see somebody else do something, we're like, wow,
yes,
maybe
exactly.
I could do that. But right now I'm working on a project. It's 1,000 mountains barefoot. And I designed this project very specifically. I was like, I need something to do. And then I asked myself, what I've been doing? And well, I had at that point already climbed like 300 mountains without shoes. And so evidently I must, that must be something I enjoy doing, because I seem to be doing it. So I like round numbers. So I set the 1,000 goal, and I thought, this will be a good multi-year strategy. And I'm getting a little bit older, so this is going to force me to be thoughtful about the aging practice and not just destroy myself. So that's turning out to be a lot of fun. And I'm at 546 now, and I'm thinking about zipping out to New Mexico. One of the Navajos' sacred mountains is out there, Mount Taylor. So that's been on my list. I think it would be cool to visit that place.
Are there any of the 400 and some that you have left? How big? I know it doesn't matter how big to call it a mountain, but are there any like ones that people would recognize and stand out that you have on your radar to hit? So
earlier last year, I finished the Northeast 111 high peaks. So that includes Mount Washington and Katahdin, as well as the other high peaks in New York, Vermont, Maine, and New Hampshire. I've done Whitney twice as part of the John Muir Trail, and I've done, out of the Colorado 14ers, I've done two.
Okay.
But I've done Elbert and Handies. But other fun ones like Saw Cid or Mount Humphrey outside of Flagstaff. And I've done some in Arizona. I just did Mount Baldy and the San Gabriels. So a smattering elsewhere as well. And by the way, I've come to appreciate, small mountains. The smallest mountain I've done is Mount Joppenberg outside Rosendale, New York. It's only 482 feet tall. I've only done it once, but it's a mountain. Somebody said, hey, it's a mountain. It's got a view at the top. It's sort of pointy, and it counts.
Yep. People that don't spend a whole lot of time on the East Coast, I think, would downplay how the mountains on the East can be extreme. They can be steep. You're probably familiar with the Barclay Marathon, but that's in Tennessee. It is in central Tennessee that is generally a plateau, but Frozen Head State Park is strangely extreme in both steepness and remoteness. And the elevation gain, I've got some buddies that go run out there from time to time, and the elevation gain you get just in a few miles is unbelievable. And it's in Tennessee, So I think there's plenty of opportunities. They don't have to be the 14ers, although I've interviewed a few guys that live in the Colorado area, and they talk about hitting these 14ers right out their back door. And I got very jealous of, having access to that kind of mountain range, but it could be anywhere. So I think that's really cool. And obviously you keep pretty good records. If you're keeping track of these things, you're keeping record of everything that you're doing. Is that fair?
Yeah. So I can give you a pie chart with the geographical distribution. And you're a finance guy, Josh. You appreciate this, but
spreadsheet monkeys.
I have so far climbed the 546 mountains I've done have represented 630,000 cumulative feet of climbing.
Wow.
So at one point I will hit 1 million feet of cumulative climbing, and that'll be sort of cool.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
That is really cool.
But, I also do something else. In my training log, I track, running, hiking, and even walking breaks. And every time I get to another 1,000 miles, that's a time for celebration, and I write up a blog post on it. So not everything it has to be extreme. And as you get older, you have to adjust some of the dials. You do not necessarily have to give up on speed or back off on whatever, but you just need to be thoughtful. You need to be understanding how your body is changing. Last year, my meniscus went out twice and it hurt so much, it woke me up at night. Then it was better. So, but you gotta understand how the body is changing. By the way, for your listeners, one of the reasons that younger people should get into this stuff now, don't wait. Now, some people wait till they're 60 and then do their amazing things, but a lot of people wait till they're 60 and they're already in the habit of waiting at that point. So go, you said you have listeners who want to learn. You want to learn, go do something now and you will learn. Guaranteed.
Yep, very good. Okay, and we could have this conversation all afternoon. I could just keep going, and we're about an hour and a half into it at this point. So I'll stop us here and say again how I really do appreciate you being generous with your time today. This has been everything I hoped the conversation would be.
Good.
And I would like to give you an opportunity to tell people where they can find you online. We've talked about the book, where they can buy the book. If they want to connect with you some other way, what's the best place to find you?
www.barefootken.com. And that'll have links to social media and other things.
And you have a blog on that website?
I have a blog there as well that you can follow.
Great. All right, Ken. Well, this has been great. And thanks again for doing this.
Josh, you are so welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the On Adventure podcast. Be on the lookout for another episode dropping in a couple weeks. And be sure to go to our YouTube page and subscribe and follow us there, as well as on all the socials from Facebook to Instagram and LinkedIn. Until our next episode, I hope you stay safe and stay on adventure.